Good evening. Tonight's story is The Painted Skin by Pu Songling, translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Pu's stories were distributed in manuscript form in China starting in about 1679 and were first printed in 1740. Giles's English translation of this story was first published in 1880, but this recording is based on his translation from 1908. As you might expect from literature that is so old and dealing, as Pu preferred, with the magical and the supernatural, these stories are weird. Like all old folklore, things often happen suddenly and with no explanation, and these stories also draw on a frame of reference that is unfamiliar to most Western readers. To try to provide missing context, Giles contributed lengthy explanatory footnotes. Because they are so long, I will read them into the story rather than have a lot of text scrolling on the screen. If you prefer, you can use the chapter markers to skip these footnotes. So now, let's open our imaginations and begin. At Taiyan, there lived a man named Wang. One morning he was out walking when he met a young lady carrying a bundle and hurrying along by herself. As she moved along with some difficulty, impeded, of course, by her bound feet, this practice is said to have originated about AD 970 with Yao Niang, the concubine of the pretender Li Yu, who wished to make her feet like the new moon. The Manchu or Tartar ladies never adopted this custom, and therefore the empresses of modern times have had feet of the natural size. Neither is it in force among the Hakkas or among the hill tribes of China and Formosa and others. The practice was forbidden in 1664 by the Manchu Emperor Qiangxi, but popular feeling was so strong on the subject that 4 years afterwards the prohibition was withdrawn. A vigorous attempt is now being made to secure natural feet for the Chinese girl, with more chance of success. As she moved along with some difficulty, Wang quickened his pace and caught her up, and found she was a pretty girl of about 16. Much smitten, he inquired whither she was going so early, and no one with her. "A traveler like you," replied the girl, "cannot alleviate my distress. Why trouble yourself to ask?" "What distress is it?" said Wang. "I'm sure I'll do anything I can for you." "My parents," answered she, "loved money, and they sold me as a concubine into a rich family where the wife was very jealous and beat and abused me morning and night. It was more than I could stand, so I have run away." Wang asked her where she was going, to which she replied that a runaway had no fixed place of abode. "My house," said Wang, "is at no great distance. What do you say to coming there?" She joyfully acquiesced, and Wang, taking up her bundle, led the way to his house. Finding no one there, she asked Wang where his family were, to which he replied that this was only the library. "And a very nice place, too," said she. "But if you are kind enough to wish to save my life, you mustn't let it be known that I am here." Wang promised he would not divulge her secret, and so she remained there for some days without anyone knowing anything about it. He then told his wife, and she, fearing the girl might belong to some influential family, advised him to send her away. This, however, he would not consent to do. When one day, going into the town, he met a Taoist priest who looked at him in astonishment and asked him what he had met. "I have met nothing," replied Wang. "Why," said the priest, "you are bewitched. What do you mean by not having met anything?" But Wang insisted that it was so, and the priest walked away, saying, "The fool! Some people don't seem to know when death is at hand." This startled Wang, who at first thought of the girl, but then he reflected that a pretty young thing as she was couldn't well be a witch, and began to suspect that the priest merely wanted to do a stroke of business. When he returned, the library door was shut, and he couldn't get in, which made him suspect that something was wrong, and so he climbed over the wall, where he found the door of the inner room shut too. Softly creeping up, he looked through the window and saw a hideous devil with a green face and jagged teeth like a saw, spreading a human skin upon the bed and painting it with a paintbrush. The devil then threw aside the brush and, giving the skin a shake-out just as you would a coat, threw it over its shoulders when, lo, It was the girl. Terrified at this, Wang hurried away with his head down in search of the priest, who had gone he knew not whither, subsequently finding him in the fields, where he threw himself on his knees and begged the priest to save him. "As to driving her away," said the priest, "the creature must be in great distress to be seeking a substitute for herself. Besides, I could hardly endure to injure a living thing." The disembodied spirits of the Chinese inferno are permitted, under certain conditions of time and good conduct, to appropriate to themselves the vitality of some human being, who, as it were, exchanges places with the so-called devil. The devil does not, however, reappear as the mortal whose life it has become possessed of, but is merely born again into the world. The idea being that the amount of life on earth is a constant quantity and cannot be increased or diminished, reminding one, in a way, of the great modern doctrine of the conservation of energy. This curious belief has an important bearing that will be brought out in a subsequent story. Here again is a Taoist priest quoting the Buddhist commandment, "Thou shalt not take life." The Buddhist laity in China, who do not hesitate to take life for the purposes of food, salve their consciences from time to time by buying birds, fishes, etc., and letting them go, in the hope that such acts will be set down on the credit side of their record of good and evil. "As to driving her away," said the priest, "the creature must be in great distress to be seeking a substitute for herself. Besides, I could hardly endure to injure a living thing." However, he gave Wang a fly brush and bade him hang it at the door of the bedroom, agreeing to meet again at the Qing temple. Wang went home, but did not dare enter the library, so he hung up the brush at the bedroom door, and before long heard a sound of footsteps outside. Not daring to move, he made his wife peep out, and she saw the girl standing looking at the brush, afraid to pass it. She then ground her teeth and went away, but in a little while came back and began cursing, saying, "You priest, you won't frighten me. Do you think I am going to give up what is already in my grasp?" Thereupon she tore the brush to pieces and, bursting open the door, walked straight up to the bed, where she ripped open Wang and tore out his heart, with which she went away. Wang's wife screamed out, and the servant came in with a light, but Wang was already dead and presented a most miserable spectacle. His wife, who was in an agony of fright, hardly dared cry for fear of making a noise, and the next day she sent Wang's brother to see the priest. The latter got into a great rage and cried out, "Was it for this that I had compassion on you, devil that you are?" Proceeding at once with Wang's brother to the house, from which the girl had disappeared without anyone knowing whither she had gone. But the priest, raising his head, looked all around and said, "Luckily, she's not far off." He then asked who lived in the apartments on the south side, to which Wang's brother replied that he did, whereupon the priest declared that there she would be found. Wang's brother was horribly frightened and said he didn't think so, and then the priest asked him if any stranger had been to the house. To this he answered that he had been out to the Qing temple and couldn't possibly say, but he went off to inquire, and in a little while came back and reported that an old woman had sought service with them as a maid-of-all-work and had been engaged by his wife. "That is she," said the priest, as Wang's brother added she was still there, and they all set out to go to the house together. Then the priest took his wooden sword and, standing in the middle of the courtyard, shouted out, "Base-born fiend, give me back my fly brush!" Meanwhile, the new maid-of-all-work was in a great state of alarm and tried to get away by the door, but the priest struck her down and she fell flat, the human skin dropped off, and she became a hideous devil. There she lay, grunting like a pig, until the priest grasped his wooden sword and struck off her head. She then became a dense column of smoke curling up from the ground, when the priest took an uncorked gourd and threw it right into the midst of the smoke. A sucking noise was heard, and the whole column was drawn into the gourd, after which the priest corked it up closely and put it in his pouch. The skin, too, which was complete even to the eyebrows, eyes, hands, and feet, he also rolled up as if it had been a scroll, and was on the point of leaving with it, when Wang's wife stopped him and with tears entreated him to bring her husband to life. The priest said he was unable to do that, but Wang's wife flung herself at his feet and with loud lamentations implored his assistance. For some time he remained immersed in thought and then replied, "My power is not equal to what you ask. I myself cannot raise the dead, but I will direct you to someone who can, and if you apply to him properly, you will succeed." Wang's wife asked the priest who it was, to which he replied, "There is a maniac in the town who passes his time groveling in the dirt. Go, prostrate yourself before him and beg him to help you. If he insults you, show no sign of anger." Wang's brother knew the man to whom he alluded, and accordingly bade the priest adieu and proceeded thither with his sister-in-law. They found the destitute creature raving away by the roadside, so filthy that it was all they could do to go near him. Wang's wife approached him on her knees, at which the maniac leered at her and cried out, "Do you love me, my beauty?" Wang's wife told him what she had come for, but he only laughed and said, "You could get plenty of other husbands. Why raise the dead one to life?" But Wang's wife entreated him to help her, whereupon he observed, "It is very strange. People apply to me to raise their dead as if I was the king of the infernal regions." He then gave Wang's wife a thrashing with his staff, which she bore without a murmur and before a gradually increasing crowd of spectators. After this, he produced a loathsome pill which he told her she must swallow, but here she broke down and was quite unable to do so. However, she did manage it at last, and then the maniac, crying out, "How you do love me!" got up and went away without taking any more notice of her. They followed him into a temple with loud supplications, but he had disappeared, and every effort to find him was unsuccessful. Overcome with rage and shame, Wang's wife went home, where she mourned bitterly over her dead husband, grievously repenting the steps she had taken and wishing only to die. She then bethought herself of preparing the corpse, near which none of the servants would venture, and set to work to close up the frightful wound of which he died. While thus employed, interrupted from time to time by her sobs, she felt a rising lump in her throat, which by and by came out with a pop and fell straight into the dead man's wound. Looking closely at it, she saw it was a human heart, and then it began, as it were, to throb, emitting a warm vapor like smoke. Much excited, she at once closed the flesh over it and held the sides of the wound together with all her might. Very soon, however, she got tired, and finding the vapor escaping from the crevices, she tore up a piece of silk and bound it round, at the same time bringing back circulation by rubbing the body and covering it up with clothes. In the night, she removed the coverings and found that breath was coming from the nose, and by the next morning her husband was alive again, though disturbed in mind as if awaking from a dream and feeling a pain in his heart. Where he had been wounded, there was a cicatrix about as big as a cash, which soon after disappeared. The end. I said it was a weird story. The image of the demon shaking out the skin and draping it around itself like a coat is especially vivid and the most enduring representation of this story throughout the centuries. Like most of the stories in the book, this one is very short, but there's a lot to unpack here. The demon going around looking for a new body and wearing this painted skin in the meantime. The priest who's going to dispel it with a fly brush. A raving maniac with the power to raise the dead. It's all just kind of stacked on top of each other without a lot of clarity or explanation. All these stories are full of shape-shifting and body-hopping, death and resurrection and reincarnation in a way that can quickly become confusing. The constant resurrecting and body-swapping also makes death less significant and final. Just because somebody dies doesn't mean the story is over. Pu Songling was born in 1640 to a poor merchant family in Sichuan. He passed the first imperial examination at the age of 18, but he failed the advanced examination. Instead of studying and progressing his education, he worked as a poor tutor, and he busied himself collecting strange stories, eventually gathering over 500 of them. In his introduction, he describes himself as spending his life in his little library in the society of his books and friends. It is this library that Giles would later translate to the word studio. Pu's story collection was immediately popular, copied and distributed widely over the decades before its first formal publication. The stories are typical of the mythology of the era, and familiar actually to most of his readers, but his literary style was regarded as superior, eventually earning him the honorary degree at age 71 that he failed to earn as a young man. Herbert Allen Giles was a British diplomat and the professor of Chinese at Cambridge for 35 years. He translated the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, the Chuang-Tzu, and a number of other works. His 1892 Chinese-English dictionary was very influential and remains a historically significant work. His was the first English translation of Pu's work and introduced these strange stories to the Western world. To read more of them, visit the link in the description below. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much for your patience with the magpies outside. There is a cat out there about which they are extremely enthusiastic. If you enjoy tales of the odd and obscure, please follow Restored Lore and click the notification link so that you never miss a story.